Today we are reviewing a hand involving an online cash player that goes by the username Jarretman. So who is Jarretman? Well, he's a PokerStars reg that plays 500 Zoom and above, and he regularly posts his sessions on YouTube under the name Help Me. Besides having a dry, monotone voice that I, for one, can truly appreciate, Jarretman, I think, is a great example of someone who's able to apply nuanced theoretical concepts in a very methodical and rational way, while also mixing in exploits when appropriate. So I thought it would be interesting to analyze one of his hands through the lens of a solver to see how his thought process matches up with the machine. So Jarretman opens it up 2.5x on the cutoff with King Jack off, and xeliqq, who is also a high stakes reg, cold calls on the button. And here are the default ranges chosen by GTOx for these positions. Now if you've ever watched a Jarretman video, you would know that he's very precise when it comes to pre-flop ranges. He understands with great specificity how ranges should change depending on the relevant variables such as position, bet sizes, stack sizes, and rake. So I reached out to Jarretman, and he was gracious enough to answer a few questions I had about this hand, including regarding preflop, and his ranges are actually very close to the ones we see here, so we're going to go ahead and just use them without modification.
Okay, so table one, in general, my approach here is going to be to simplify as much as possible. And I do think that despite how the board looks, we have to do a lot of checking. And the deeper we are in this board, the more we have to check. And all of that put together, I don't even mind range checking this board. I doubt you lose much EV. If this was like King 10-4 rainbow and we were under the gun versus button, then I would rather just range bet small.
So the flop comes King 10-4 two-tone, and Jarretman decides to check with top pair. He indicates that he should be doing a lot of checking given this formation, despite how the board looks, especially given the fact that they are deep, and that he even wouldn't mind range checking here. So what does the solver say about this spot? Well, we see that the solver is indeed checking over 40% of the range, and the EV regret for check is 1.9%. This means that if Jarretman decided to check 100% of all the hands in his range in this spot, the maximum amount of EV he would lose playing against a GTO opponent would be around 0.12 big blinds. So why is this when the board appears to favor the pre-flop aggressor? Well, if we take a look at the equity graph, the distributions are very symmetrical for the most part, and Jarretman actually has significantly more trash in his range given that he opened in the cutoff and xeliqq cold called on the button. As most of you know, the optimal cold calling range in a no-ante game will typically be very tight. So even though the preflop raiser will often have advantages at the top of the range, largely due to overpairs, in terms of overall range composition, the range advantage may be neutral or perhaps more favorable to the caller, as is the case here where the button has higher average EV and equity. Couple this with the fact that the cutoff is out of position, the preflop aggressor will often be doing a significant amount of checking, and when he bets, the sizing will often be small. And as Jarretman noted, this impact of position is exacerbated when stacks get deeper, since the in-position player's realization advantage gets magnified when there's more left behind. Jarretman also notes as an aside that if he were under the gun and the board was King 10-4 rainbow instead, then he would rather range bet small. So as an experiment, we ran the exact same sim, but put Jarretman in the low jack instead of the cutoff, and changed the board from two-tone to rainbow, and lo and behold, we see that the range is doing a lot more betting, and the EV regret for a quarter pot bet is now the lowest at 1.4%. And the reason for this is 1, the low jack's range is just much tighter than the cutoffs, and 2, the rainbow board is drier, which means the button's cold calling range, which is very suited combo heavy, should have a greater number of lower equity combos that will fold more often against pressure on this board compared to when the board is two-tone.
But I think here, and we're gonna go for the check call. I think his size is a little bit too small. I think going for something more like pot or 75 is better. Half can't be bad though. Very, very small differences in anything.
xeliqq bets around half pot and Jarretman calls. He notes that although he doesn't think this sizing is necessarily bad, he would expect to see more often a larger 3/4 pot or full pot sizing in xeliqq's shoes, and we see that the solver generally agrees with this assessment. This bet is actually the least used action, and the full pot size frequency is more than double.
And then on table 1, we're gonna call, but this size makes no sense. This half pot barrel makes no sense here. He really wants to play like a super big bet or check strategy. Like, what's he saying he has that wants to bet half pot? Basically nothing.
Jarretman calls, the turn is the 5 of spades. Jarretman checks, and xeliqq barrels with another bet of slightly less than half pot, which confuses Jarretman, who indicates he would expect to see a very large bet or check here on the turn. And we do see that this is the least used sizing, and that the solver much rather prefers either the checking option or the overbet option. In fact, when we resolve this turn to a very fine accuracy with simple postflop, we see that this half pot bet is basically not used at all. So why is this? Well, I asked Jarretman to elaborate on this, and in his view, most of the button's hands that want to bet in this spot will tend to want to bet much bigger. Or in other words, you would expect the button's range to play in a more polar fashion. And if we break down xeliqq's range in this spot, this logic makes sense. We see that the biggest advantage xeliqq has here is at the very top of the range, with hands of around 75% equity or more, comprising around 40% of the button's range and only 10% of the cutoff's range. And you can attribute this, at least in part, to the fact that Jarretman did not bet or raise the flop, which doesn't completely cap his range, but as we can see, should remove a significant number of the strongest hands from his range. And since the 5 on the turn doesn't change too much, the overall composition of the cutoff's range remains largely the same. So many of these hands in the button's range, especially the sets, 2 pairs, and strongest kings, have the incentive to grow the pot large, especially given the high SPR. In contrast, xeliqq's middling hands, which you might expect this type of half pot bet to represent, comprises a relatively small portion of the button's overall range, and these hands don't have a strong incentive to grow the pot. A hand like pocket jacks or 10x, for example, is not likely to get called by much worse on a second barrel, and of course, any bet creates the opportunity for a check raise, which this type of hand does not want. So instead, these middling hands would appear to prefer to close the action and get one step closer to realizing their equity, especially when not holding the flush draw. And the button's weakest hands that have limited to no showdown value will, of course, benefit significantly from folds, and the larger the bet, the more fold leverage these hands will yield. Right, this particular bet should only get around 30% of the cutoff's range to fold, whereas the 150% overbet should fold out nearly double that amount. So we see that the button's unmade hands with high equity draws are betting 150% over 44% of the time, with an EV regret of 1.3%.
My guess is he has something that he shouldn't be betting on the turn, like ace-10. Yeah, exactly, ace-10. Ace-10 of spades, though. I mean, that can overbet the turn. Betting the flop with ace-10 of spades, sure. It's good. Like, we have lots of worse 10x to call him. But then the half pot bet on the turn just makes no sense. However, all that considered, I don't think we ever want to raise king jack. There's a lot of stack depth remaining and a lot of different rivers that we're gonna have to play, and I don't think king jack really makes it into the check raising range. So yeah, if you know your opponent is doing bad splitting on the turn here, so like just sizing their hand all the time and not, you know, picking good sizes, then you can start doing some crazy things like check raising king jack, but then You know, it's very easy to start leveling yourself because even if they're doing this bad hand splitting, they can still find some hands to put into the other sizes some of the time, and they can find 3-bets. Like, I think this player could potentially find 3-bets with a hand like this. So then you raise fold the turn with king jack. You know, you kind of start leveling yourself.
The river is the deuce of hearts, and it goes check check, and Jarretman calls out xeliqq's specific holding, ace 10. So is Jarretman psychic? Well, perhaps, but in this specific scenario, given that the button should not have been using the half pot sizing on the turn, Jarretman made the assumption that xeliqq was sizing his hand, or in other words, he tailored his bet size specifically to the strength of his second pair. And the risk of doing this is that if you are devising a unique betting strategy that only applies to one or a small group of combos, and your opponent becomes aware of this, it essentially turns your hand face up, which of course can be exploited. As Jarretman indicated, if you bet smallish only with your middling hands and your opponent knows this, he could get very thin value by raising with better or by applying a ton of pressure with his bluffs, knowing that you're capped. In fact, if we node lock the turn so that this sizing is only used for the button's middling pairs 20% of the time and not with any other combos, and we calculate the solver's EV maximizing strategy against this range, we see that not only will king jack raise, but nearly the cutoff's entire range will start raising, including by doing a significant amount of shoving. So I thought this was an interesting hand, not in terms of a crazy triple barrel all in, but in terms of getting a first-person view of how a high-level player approaches play using an EV-driven thought process. And this type of insight, I think, is what makes Jarretman's channel so valuable. His videos are not just a bunch of filtered highlights like many others. Instead, they are raw, uncut footage from beginning to end, showing everything, the good and the bad, including superficially mundane spots like a c-bet fold or a check fold. In reality, these are the types of hands that we will be playing most of the time, so navigating them effectively can accrue a significant amount of EV over the long run.